Lecture 1, The Land and Its Lure.
Palestine consists of the territory that lies between the Mediterranean Sea on the west, Lebanon in the north, the Gulf of Aqaba and the Sinai Peninsula on the south, and the Jordan River on the east. Like most things pertaining to this area, even the geography of what is meant by Palestine is not without dispute. One group of Zionists, for example, Jewish nationalists, called the revisionist Zionists, seek to include present-day Jordan as well as present-day Israel and the occupied territories within the boundaries of historic Palestine. Although this group is on the right of Israeli politics, they hold a lot in common on this topic with one of the most left-wing of the Palestinian guerrilla groups, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who coined the slogan, "The road to Jerusalem begins in Amman." Palestine thus covers a very small geographic area and includes a relatively small population. Compare, for example, Palestine or Israel's current 6 million citizens with Egypt's 65 million citizens. Nevertheless, in spite of the small size of the territory and the populations involved, the dispute between two rival sets of nationalisms, which claim the sole right to control the territory of Palestine, has remained at the forefront of international attention for more than half a century. One is reminded about the comment of H. Monroe, who took the literary name Saki, his comment about the island of Crete. According to Saki, Crete is an island that, quote, has produced far more history than can be consumed locally, unquote. The same holds for Palestine. The purpose of this course is to track the history of Palestine and the two rival sets of nationalisms which claim it. We're going to trace the history from the 19th century through the present day. This introductory lecture has two main goals. First, it will describe the main physical characteristics of Palestine-Israel occupied territories so that we're all on the same page when it comes to the description of the history. And secondly, this lecture will demonstrate how two rival nationalisms, Palestinian nationalism on the one hand, Zionism on the other hand, have established their connection to the land through creating historical narratives, through naming, through historical archaeology. The physical geography of Palestine provides an important key to understanding the history of the territory. Palestine, it must be understood to begin with, is a territory of diverse topography. At the center of the region is a range of hills stretching from Lebanon in the north to the Negev desert in the south. The hills are interrupted in the Galilee region by the Valley of Jezreel. Now, for millennia, the Valley of Jezreel was a major trade route connecting civilizations in the east with the coast to their west. It provided the path for many conquerors as well, from Assyrians to Persians. Now, south of the Valley of Jezreel is a hilly area which was the center of ancient Jewish settlement and is the site of Jerusalem. Today, this plateau forms what Palestinians call the occupied West Bank, what many Israelis call Judea and Samaria after their biblical names. This area is heavily populated by Palestinians. Many of these Palestinians are indigenous to the region, to that particular area. Others fled to that particular area after the 1948 war. To the west of the hilly area, there is a coastal plain. The coastal plain provided two main centers for Jewish immigration in the 19th century. One was centered around the cities of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, and the other about a third of the way up to the port city of Haifa. To the east of the hilly areas, there is an area called the Jordanian Depression. This is not a psychological term. It refers to the fact that the area is low-lying. The area is marked by the Dead Sea, which is below sea level, the lowest elevation of land on the planet. To the south of the hilly area is the Negev Desert, which, until the establishment of the State of Israel, was largely inhabited by Bedouin. I say largely inhabited by Bedouin. It wasn't extraordinarily densely occupied, but the residents who were there tended to be Bedouin. Bedouin were removed from the area. Many of the Bedouin were removed from the area after the establishment of the State of Israel. There are a number of cities in Israel and Palestine which also have played a significant role in history. The northernmost city, seaport in Israel, is the port city of Acre. Acre was the principal harbor for the First Crusade, which took off in 1095. The First Crusade, of course, was the only truly successful crusade. Heading south along the seacoast lies Haifa, the principal seaport of Israel. Haifa was originally built during the 18th century by an Ottoman vassal. We'll talk about this in more detail in upcoming lectures, who was interested in expanding trade with Europe. The port was modernized and expanded when the British ran the area in the post-World War I period. It was expanded because it served as a terminus for the oil pipeline that stretched from the northern oil fields of Iraq all the way through to the Mediterranean. Heading further south along the seafront is Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909 as a Jewish suburb of the Palestinian city of Jaffa. It lies, again, to the south of Haifa and is today the largest city in Israel. It also tends to be, according to many Israelis, the most cosmopolitan of the cities of Israel. Jerusalem lies inland. According to the Bible, Jerusalem was originally built by a group of people that we don't know very much about called the Jebusites. The principal significance of Jerusalem for most of its history has been religious. For Jews, it served as the capital, as described in the Bible, of David and Solomon's kingdom. For Muslims, on the other hand, it was the site of Muhammad's night journey to heaven. Now, there are a number of towns on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that remain the center of Palestinian life in the occupied territories. Nablus, Ramallah, Hebron, also known as Khalil, and Jericho, which is the seat of the current Palestinian Authority, which was set up in the aftermath of the Oslo Accord. In the Gaza Strip, the most significant urban concentration is Gaza City. Both the Jewish and the Palestinian communities base their claims to the land, to exclusive control over the land, on ancient habitation. The Jewish claim to Palestine can be found in the Bible. According to the Bible, Jewish habitation of Palestine began with Abraham and his descendants who immigrated to Palestine during the second millennium BC. Probably now it's thought from Iraq. Many scholars consider the 10th century BC reigns of King David and King Solomon to be the high point of Jewish presence in Palestine. Nevertheless, biblical accounts also tell us of periods of exile, for example, periods in which Jews were taken by Assyrians or went to Egypt, for example. Political divisions, as when Judea and Samaria split, Judea and Israel split, and wars with other inhabitants of the land, most notably the Philistines. The Romans conquered Jerusalem, the capital of David's and Solomon's kingdom, in 63 BC. In AD 135, after a series of anti-Roman revolts broke out, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and enslaved or slaughtered most of its inhabitants, dispersed the Jewish community outside of Palestine. Without a central site, Jewish life centered in that dispersed community. That dispersed community is known as the Jewish diaspora. The diaspora remained central to Jewish life until the emergence of the Zionist movement and the birth of the State of Israel. The Palestinian claim to historic Palestine is based on both ancient and continuous habitation of the territory that is Palestine. The indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were of two peoples. First of all, they were the Canaanites, who spoke a dialect of a northern Semitic language, actually. There are three major contemporary languages of the Semitic language family. Two of them are spoken fairly widely, Arabic and Hebrew. The third is Aramaic, which is currently spoken in 2 or 3 villages in Syria alone. But the Canaanites spoke a northern Semitic language, which is related to Arabic and Hebrew. Then there were the Philistines. The Philistines, many archaeologists associate with the so-called peoples of the sea, who began to invade coastal areas in the 12th century or so BC. The Philistines came to Palestine, apparently, around the 12th century BC. They were the ones, of course, who gave their names to the area. The Romans called the province Palestina, and to this very day, Palestinians call their homeland Philistine. That might not conjure up the best images in Western minds. The Philistines, of course, have gotten an extremely bad rap from history. Contrary to biblical accounts, however, traces of the Philistine civilization have recently been dug up and indicate that the Philistines were likely on an even higher level of culture than the pastoral tribes of the biblical patriarchs. The Philistines, of course, being peoples of the sea, inhabited the coastal area. The Jews inhabited, for the most part, the inland area. The area that currently one of the main points of Zionist immigration was the coastal area, and Palestinians are now crowded into the hilly internal area. One of the ironies of history that each of the territories that are being claimed now as homelands were actually the homelands at an earlier point in history of their political rivals. By the way, the use of the term Philistine to mean an uncouth person came much, much later. The first recorded use of the term was by the chaplain at the University of Jena in Germany, or what is today Germany, in 1694, who claimed that the townsmen of Jena who beat up his students were no better than the Philistines of the Bible. The term stuck, not of course to the residents of Jena, but to any people who hold scholarly endeavor in contempt. Many of my students, for example. Before the Islamic conquests, large numbers of Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula began to drift north. There was a variety of reasons why they did so. We'll talk about this a little further on in the second lecture. They established themselves throughout the Fertile Crescent and the westernmost part of the Fertile Crescent, which of course is Palestine. Muhammad established the first Islamic community in the Arabian town of Medina in AD 622. That's the first year of the Islamic calendar. It's indicative, by the way, of Islam that we're really not that sure of the date of Muhammad's birth, but we are absolutely certain of the date of his migration from Mecca to Medina. It demonstrates the fact that unlike the Christians who date their calendar from the birth of Christ, before Christ, and then Anno Domini, the Muslims who begin their calendar with this event don't place the central point of their history in terms of the life of a single individual. They look at the history as measured in the development, the beginnings, the origins, and the evolution of the Islamic community, the first successful community of which was established in AD 622. Islamic conquests began even before Muhammad's death, and over time, most of the inhabitants of Palestine converted to Islam and adopted Arabic as their native language. This is the most rudimentary description of the origins of the story of the Israeli claims to the land and the Palestinian claims to the land as told through their national histories. What's important, of course, is that each side emphasizes the very, very important parts of their history, true or not, which gives them claim to the land. Both sides in the conflict, however, also use other means to assert their claims to the land as well, not just creating a historical narrative, but, for example, both sides attempt to redefine the land by imposing their own place names to it. For example, Israelis call the territory that they now occupy territories between their internationally recognized borders on the west and the Jordan River on the east. They call these territories Judea and Samaria, after the biblical names. Palestinians, on the other hand, call it this territory the occupied West Bank. The Israelis call the suburb of Tel Aviv Yaffo. The Palestinians call what they consider to be the main city, after all, Tel Aviv was built as a suburb to this city, Jaffa. Let me just say one word about my use of vocabulary in this lecture series. Don't read anything into it. I am not going to be asserting Israeli claims. I am not going to be asserting Palestinian claims through the use of terminology. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be extremely careless when it comes to terminology, determining what term I will use for a given area, for the most part by what comes trippingly off my tongue. and with no hidden political agenda. Let me also say something about the terms for the two major protagonists in this conflict, in this series. We can call them now Israelis, we can call them Palestinians. Before 1948, we could not have called the Israelis Israelis, after all, because there was no Israel yet. So I shall be, for the most part, calling them Zionists, and in some cases shall be calling them Jews. Here's the rub. The rub is that neither the term Zionist nor the term Jews, for those people who are of Jewish descent in Palestine, is an accurate term. There are many people who of Jewish descent in Palestine who are not Zionists, for example. There are also many Zionists who are not Jews. So you have to understand that I'm using both terms with a certain amount of flexibility. I am also, unless I misspeak, going to attempt to use the word, not to use the word Palestinian before it becomes a fact that most residents of the region begin to view themselves as a separate Palestinian nationality. Before this occurred, which was probably during the late interwar period, I'm going to be using the term the indigenous inhabitants of Palestine. It's quite a mouthful, so I'll probably slip up one or two times during this lecture series. But just imagine, or just remember, we'll describe this in a future lecture, the term Palestinian is anachronistic before the interwar period at least. And the reason for this is, yes, there were people living in the area, but no, there were no Palestinians yet in the area. We will talk about the seeming contradiction in a forthcoming lecture. Both sides also label and highlight specific historical events so that they will fit into their nationalist accounts. For example, the Israelis talk about a war of independence, they talk about the establishment of a state of Israel, and they talk about Shoah to refer to events that Palestinians refer to as the First Palestine War, or the Nakba, the disaster, and the Jewish Holocaust, meaning, of course, that many Palestinians consider their Holocaust, 1948, as a equally important chapter in their own nationalist narrative. Both sides begin the narratives of their history in different places, and they use the past to explain the present. The Israelis thus point to the migration of Abraham, for example, from Iraq as a starting point of their claims to the land. Abraham, as I said, came from Iraq, moved to Palestine. Palestinians are just as likely to ask, who do you think brought Abraham the welcome wagon when he arrived in Palestine, thus asserting their claim as well. Now, this is why archaeology is so important to both sides. In part, they use archaeology in order to reassert their claims, to prove their claims to the land. Let's take one example. The use of one particular site by the Israelis to reaffirm their bond to the land and also to reaffirm their national narrative. I want to use the example of the fortress of Masada. Masada was a fortress, or is a fortress actually, near the Dead Sea, where Jewish rebels made their last stand against the Romans in AD 74. According to one account, Jews committed mass suicide rather than surrender to the Romans. According to this account, written by Josephus, the Romans, quote, encountering the mass of the slain, instead of exulting as over enemies, they admired the nobility of their resolve and the contempt of death displayed by so many in carrying it unwaveringly into execution. The ruins of Masada thus provide what one historian has called, quote, an elaborate and persuasive stage scenery for a modern passion play of national rebirth. Now, Israelis began their excavations of Masada in the early 60s. The excavations began in 1963, lasted through 1965. And Israelis consider Masada to be an extremely important part of the national collective consciousness. Masada is maintained by the Israeli National Parks Authority, for example. It is a site where the Israeli Tank Corps is sworn in. And in 1968, the Israeli government organized a mass reburial of the skeletons that were found at the site. Now think about it. Why 1968? Well, it's just the year after, of course, 1967, obviously. But the war of 1967 confirmed the Israelis' belief in their ability to sustain a nation in the face of what they considered to be overwhelming odds, and reaffirmed the Zionist, the Jewish nationalist ethic. Now, as a result of this, 1967, 1968, of course, it's little wonder that the phrase, Masada shall not fall again, became a phrase widely recognized in Israel and can be found, for example, on coffee mugs and T-shirts that are currently on sale at the souvenir shops near the site. The idea, of course, was that in the wake of 1967, when Arab armies were arrayed against Israel, Masada shall not fall again, proved to be correct. Archaeologist Yigael Yadin put it this way: its scientific importance is known to be great, but more than that, Masada represents for all of us in Israel and for many elsewhere, archaeologists and laymen, a symbol of courage, a monument of our great national figures, heroes who chose death over life of physical and moral serfdom. Now, there's one problem with the the dominant Zionist narrative of Masada. The entire story of the mass suicide is dubious at best. Our main source of this story about nationalists who are willing to give up their lives for the sake of their country rather than submit to foreign authority was recorded by the Roman historian Josephus in his Jewish War. Josephus was a Jewish turncoat, a renegade, who very likely manufactured the entire story to slander those people who held the fortress of Masada, the so-called zealots, the knife wielders. We get our current term zealots from this group. What Josephus was doing was not celebrating their commitment to the national idea, but instead portraying the barbarity of people who would kill themselves, their women, and their children. There are other details as well that are doubtful. There are remains of pigs that have been found, for example, in the kitchen areas. And the trope of mass suicide is a trope that's fairly common in the classical period. Suicide, of course, is not condoned by Jewish law. And for the most part, the entire incident of Masada is ignored in every other Jewish text. So here we have a myth, or a story that may likely be a myth, that has become a central part of a nationalist narrative. And I focused on the Israeli national narrative because fundamentally the Palestinians have yet to create a state which can support a nationalist myth in the form of national parks, in the form of guided tours, souvenir mugs, and T-shirts. Ultimately, the moral of the story is the following, I think. In the words of George Orwell, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future.